I hope you have had as brilliant a day listening to the variety of talks and seeing the presentations as I've had. And I hope you're feeling less zonked by it than I am. So this is the time to sit back, relax, and hear the panel discuss some of the more broader, overarching issues. So the panel is focusing on autism as an identity, and it is led by Dr. Damian Milton. Damian Milton is a very well-known figure in the autism world, not just in the UK, but worldwide, as an advocate for including people, as autistic people and people on the spectrum in research, and also talking about the double empathy problem, as we heard earlier today. So Damian will introduce the other panel members. Damian himself is in the University of Kent at the Tizard Center, but his role in the participatory autism research is really what he is known worldwide for. So over to you, Damian.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. So, other than being an autistic sociologist, I'm also a father to an autistic teenage son who has severe learning disabilities as well. And he wouldn't understand what the word identity means as a term. Yet he still very much has a personal and social identity. And last year at this conference I talked about sociological perspectives in the field of autism. And so to me, personal and social identities of autistic people is a very serious matter to take hold of. I'm also really glad to bring this panel together and share it. There's been some talk I've seen of late around the topic of neurodiversity and autistic identity. A lot of it being very ill-informed, criticisms and so on. So hopefully some of those will be put to bed today. And I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed panel, all of whom I've known for some time now and their work, and I'm very proud to introduce them. We have Gill Loomes, Virginia Bovell, Robert Chapman at the end, and Stephen Kapp here in the middle. So we've mixed up the order a little bit. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute, and they're all going to talk about the issue of autism and identity from their own perspectives. So they'll be talking on potentially different aspects of that. Once they've all had about 5 minutes to say what they want to, we'll take questions from you all. You can raise your hand and do it that way. You can also write a question on a piece of paper if you want to. If you want to pass that down to our colleagues from the Uni of Reading at the front, they'll pass them on to me, and so we can also ask questions that way. So I'll pass over to Gill.
So thanks, Damian. I'm Gill Loomes. I'm a social scientist based at the University of Leeds in the School of Law. My research is actually around mental capacity law and how that operates in practice. Alongside that, I have a career of about 15 years of working in various third sector organisations, looking at advocacy and mentoring services and how we can develop those to be more, in inverted commas, autism friendly. So how we can sort of bring an autistic flavour to advocacy provision. I think that there are two things in what I've just said that are going to influence what I say right now. I think Firstly, I mentioned that I'm researching mental capacity law while alongside that working in the field of autism. One of the things that I've got from that is really informing my ideas on autism as an identity, and particularly as a social and political identity, is the ways in which we can bring what it means to be autistic people in the world and our experiences, our individual and collective experiences of autism, how we can bring those and kind of contribute them to the various other kind of social domains, political domains we find ourselves in. So rather than necessarily sticking to what we might think of as the autism bubble, how we can be autistic in other social and political spaces, and how autistic experiences and views and what might previously have been thought of as kind of special needs might be sort of seen as ways of speaking to and shaping the world that might benefit everybody in the sense of kind of emphasising our shared humanity. The second thing that I was going to say, I have now forgotten, so I'll go on to to the kind of core points of what I wanted to say. I think thinking about autism as an identity, the first point that we might want to think of is that actually, when we think about what identity is, I mean, identity is in itself a very slippery concept. It's what we might think of after W.B. Galli as being the idea of an essentially contested concept, the kind of idea that we might each have a different perspective on, and we can't necessarily nail down exactly what the essence of identity is. So in speaking about identity, we're kind of, we're going to come from lots of different perspectives and have multiple different ideas, and it's important that we're aware of that, so we don't kind of trip each other up in trying to sort of chase that sort of essence that we might be chasing for rather a long time. I think, having said that, I do feel strongly that I have an autistic identity. And I've always felt that, ever since I knew I was autistic. And at that time, when I first discovered I was autistic, which is quite a while ago now, and certainly a long time ago in terms of our understanding and our developing understanding of autism, at that time, it was not really accepted in kind of authoritative discourse around autism that autism might be an identity issue, that it might be something that we might see as a core part of us. It was seen as something from which we might want to distance ourselves. So my diagnosing psychologist really played down the idea of me being autistic to my mother, trying to sort of, be sort of consoling in the idea that, I was autistic, but I'd probably grow out of it, That's actually in my diagnostic report, by the way. Never felt like that to me. Felt like a core part of who I am. After Jim Sinclair's wonderful quote that I used to have on my office wall about autism not being a shell from which we can try and escape, I felt like it was a core part of who I am. Interestingly, there's an irony there, or a kind of challenging paradox, in that, in feeling different than kind of accepted autism discourse, authoritative autism discourse, I actually, in a lot of ways, felt distanced from my autistic identity. I felt like I couldn't quite be autistic enough. If I had the social awareness and the social intelligence to feel that I had an identity, how could I possibly be autistic if the essence of autism, as I was finding out, was that I couldn't have an identity and I couldn't have social intelligence? That was a problem for me. It was deeply uncomfortable, and I'm really glad that we've moved on. I'm glad that we're here today talking about identity. But the thing that I'd say in conclusion is that I think that we need to think about autistic identity as a starting point. It's not an end in itself. It's not that we identify ourselves as autistic individually and we stop there. It's that in having that identity and finding our own place in the world, it's a way of developing a worldview that can enable us to collectively impact on the world and to make the world a better place together. And I'll finish there now.
Stephen?
Well, I work as a research fellow on a project exploring diagnosis, autism, and the neurodiversity movement. And we talk sometimes about autism as kind of a social construct versus as a kind of a scientific construct. And I think we agree, and obviously it is a social construct, and it can politically and personally help people to have an autistic identity. And I think the identity is grounded in culture and actual communities of people gathering and developing common, some forms of language or events or different ways that people develop culture. And I think, and there have been different studies about accepting autism, actually helping autistic people's mental health, for example, and so I think that's very important. So how useful is autism as a diagnosis? And I think people can make an argument there, and I think also on the side of self-identifying, for example, which is one of the studies that's part of the project. Well, I've done research where we've included autistic people both self-identify but lack a formal diagnosis, and who are officially diagnosed and unsurprisingly view themselves as autistic. And I think it's really that identity that really is the more overriding factor in terms of how similar responses look like between autistic and non-autistic people. And if anything, the responses by people with an official diagnosis tend to be even more radical, because sometimes there's this, people try to disempower people from having some voice and identity of coming to a diagnosis on their own terms, and say, well, it's actually, this movement is really being led by people who aren't even autistic, and that's generally not true. So, and there are all sorts of pragmatic reasons why people might have difficulty accessing diagnosis, and it might take years or be expensive, and there might be few specialists, and it would be intensive to try to get. And then even if you get it, there might be few services and supports available, or people wouldn't really have much recourse to them practically because there might be discrimination. And I think there was that neurodiversity employment study I heard about today, and that Autistic has been funding, and about 85, I think, what was the 85% of autistic employees masking at work, and also reporting negative experiences such as negative forms of discrimination, and that lead them to not disclose at work. So, and if you don't disclose, you don't officially have a legal recourse to reasonable adjustment. So, so I think it's important to listen to and respect people, and I think on more of a biological level too, that I think that there's some validity to the notion of autism as a construct, but I don't think it I don't think we should think too rigidly about diagnoses, because I think there are some actual patterns of human traits that tend to cluster together in certain ways, and that maybe people who have these general features, that they can actually, some can actually, that might be more than, the whole might be more than the sum of the parts, or that they might actually interact in a meaningful way. It's not random. And it can provide a useful explanation. But I think if we were to try to actually understand autism and also understand it as an identity, we would need to go beyond a medical diagnosis and beyond a purely diagnostic framework as it's defined now, because I think it would have to allow neutral differences or potential strengths that actually often do manifest as sometimes as challenges selectively, so that are overall differences, and we do have a study on that as part of the project too. It's kind of a strengths as differences account of autism. So.
Thank you, Steve. Virginia?
Okay. I did a research project within the field of bioethics, and the question was, is it morally legitimate to seek to cure or prevent autism? I also have a 25-year-old son who has autism, and what I now know from DSM-5 are specifiers of intellectual disability and gastrointestinal problems, and possibly some other things as well. I was very influenced by Jim Sinclair also. Just to refresh people's minds, or for those of you who haven't heard it, I'm just going to quote one small part. He says, "When parents say, 'I wish my child did not have autism,' what they're really saying is, 'I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead.'" And he goes on to talk about the emotional trauma of hearing a message that, in a sense, as an autistic child, you are not wanted, that somebody else would have been preferable. I'm also very honoured to have met Anya Ustasvesky, who is an autistic self-advocate, and she just said in an article, "If you take away my autism, you take away me." So these are both very clear statements made by able and verbal autistic adults that their autism and their sense of essence, who they are as an individual, are fundamentally the same. And they both point to the offence that they feel when people ask for a cure. Despite this, some other autistic people, as you'll be aware, and some parents dispute the equation of autism and identity, or someone's essence. They hotly disagree that autism is like the whole of a person, and they further argue that those who have put forward an equation of autism and identity are the more intellectually able and verbal people on the spectrum. So I'd like to explore this apparent contradiction. I do think there's a problem, both because autism is an evolving concept. The very fact that DSMs evolve and change shows that it's not a fixed thing in time. So, because it's an evolving concept, and because the spectrum is so wide, inevitably, people will describe it and experience from the outside, see it as difference. That the only thing we've come up with so far are the two main criteria, which is the social communication and the repetitive behaviours. Now, clearly, they are observed things from the outside, but what those who have autism, who are autistic, I apologise, say is that that doesn't sum up their subjective experience. That's not the experience of being autistic at all. And indeed, go on to say, and Joe Scanlon in the last stream session, I absolutely echoed what he said, that actually sometimes the co-occurring conditions are the things that cause stress and suffering, not those two almost arbitrary core symptoms. I echo that on behalf of my son, for whom gastrointestinal pain has, up until the last few years, almost ruined his life, but for whom I don't think his autism or his fairly profound learning disabilities have really impacted on his sense of well-being or in his ability to access things that are important and enjoyable to him. So I'd like to say a bit more about that. I was once talking to a clinician about the prevention and cure argument versus the let's tackle the comorbidities argument, and he said, but we do need to prevent and treat autism because of the comorbidities. And I think we're suffering from a category error here. If someone said to me, being a woman, you're more likely than men to get ovarian cancer, I would agree. It's obviously true. But if they said, you've got ovarian cancer, therefore it would be better if you were a man, I would say they're being absurd. If we plug this comparison into the topic under discussion, I might say, or somebody might say of themselves, and we've had lots of presentations about this, all of which have been fascinating, being autistic, I may be more prone to a certain type of anxiety. But this is very different from saying, because I suffer from anxiety, it would be better if I were neurotypical. And so my plea to the advocacy movement, to parents who think they want a cure, quite apart from the offence that it might cause people who understand that message as being, you'd be better if you were someone else. It isn't just about semantics. It's not just about being overly picky. It's about being very careful what it is we're exploring and why we're exploring it. And my final statement is, again, reverting to my son. Yes, he occupies more of the public sector budget, but he does far less harm than somebody like Philip Green.
Robert?
Hi. Just a bit about me. I'm at the University of Bristol. Like Virginia, I did a PhD on the ethics of autism. People always assume I must work in a psychology department when I say I work on autism, but I work in a philosophy department. Someone actually said earlier in one of the talks that they did a PhD because they read Deborah Barnbaum's book, The Ethics of Autism, and they disliked it so much that they needed to do a PhD to prove them wrong. And but I did exactly the same thing. So, and I think quite. Oh, yes. Did you do that too, Damian? Or no, you did. Okay, so lots of people have done that. It sounds like Deborah Barnbaum has generated impact in a very strange way. It's backfired on her. So I'm autistic. You don't really need to know much about me. I guess I got a diagnosis as a teenager after very typical story, struggling for years, dropping out of school, not being able to function, all the wrong labels, stupid from teachers and stuff like that. Found autism diagnosis liberating in some ways, but then also, of course, I found the medicalised aspects stifling in other ways, existentially stifling. You read stuff and it says autistic people can't do this, and that just seems like it's cut off from your possibilities if people say that. And then later, like many other autistic people, came to the idea of neurodiversity and autism as a political identity. So about autism as an identity, and when I say that I mean a political identity, usually this is framed as in it's either a disorder or an identity. And if it's an identity, it's a kind of political classification, and if it's a disorder, it's a medical and scientific one. I'd like to stress, actually, I think that autism has always been a political classification, more primarily than a medical one, even though it's always been framed in medical vocabularies, it's always been medicalised. So think here about where the concept emerged from. It had been floating around as a term since 1908, but it became used in the way that we use it by Hans Asperger and his colleagues under Nazi rule in Vienna in the late 1930s. And if you read his early presentations, so his presentation from 1938, for example, they didn't do scientific research, they didn't make a discovery, they didn't discover autism, right? It wasn't like finding that water is made by is H2O or something like that. It was just a useful way of them classifying some people. For them I think it was just middle class white boys who were not doing very well at school in certain ways. And it wasn't a product of discovery. It was a political baptism of a new kind of person. It wasn't a scientific discovery. They didn't even claim that it had medical use. If you go back and read his papers, the use he seems to have for it is it's a useful way of classifying people to think about the value of their life. Because at the time, there was, I'm sure everyone will know a bit about this, but there was the Nazi eugenics program. They were just exterminating disabled people. And that was why he found it useful to think about the value of this certain kind of new grouping of people he made. So it emerged as a political concept, even though it was kind of framed in medical vocabulary. There was nothing I can see medical about it. They didn't even claim it had a medical use. Now, lots has changed since then, of course, but some things are similar in important ways. So today, I'm still not convinced that autism has direct, medical use as a concept, right? I don't think it's the kind of thing that you could get diagnosed with and that one day someone will invent something that you can go and kind of take a medication or something like that and feel better or something. It's not that kind of thing. It doesn't have anything like a biological or neurological essence. It doesn't seem to have anything like that. A diagnosis of autism today is still primarily political. What it does is open certain doors. It closes other doors. It opens up new existential possibilities of joining new communities of people, perhaps, for some people anyway, and it might cut off others. It changes how people relate to you. It changes how people value you. Some people will be more open to accepting you, some people will shun you because of the label. So it's still primarily a political classification, even though we still talk about it in medicalized vocabularies. I think, just very briefly to finish up, this is really important to acknowledge, I think, and be more open about, because there's something inherently political about the concept of autism. And throughout most of the history of autism, this classification has not been owned by autistic people. It's not been owned by the people who are given that label. It's been, the people who control the narrative are non-autistic people. Often well-meaning people, doctors and so forth, sometimes literal Nazis, as I mentioned, and everything in between. Once we acknowledge that there is something inherently political about the classification of autism, and I don't think that will ever go away, as long as there is a classification called autism, it will be political in nature primarily. It will be about the value of lives and, everything that comes with that. Once we admit this, you can see why autism as political identity, I think, is so important, because it gives those people who are labelled a voice, it gives you a say, it gives you more control of the narrative. I think that's the key reason it's so important, but I'll leave it there.
So, has there been any questions handed forward, or shall we go to hands up for the question?
My question's for the last speaker. I'm quite fascinated by that. I agree with everything that everyone said. I have a son who's 26, and I think he's autistic, and that is absolutely his identity. But as a parent of a child who was diagnosed at 2, and I think from a medical, obviously he was diagnosed by a paediatrician, as counter autism, I find it difficult to see how it was political, because it helps define as a parent the type of support I needed to give him. I'm not saying there isn't a political side to it, but do you recognise that there can be cases when there isn't?
Thanks. Just briefly, no, I don't recognise that there are cases where it isn't, but I can explain why. In the sense, it depends what we mean by political. I think that every time someone decides that their child is a girl or a boy, that's a political act in an important sense, and that's going to define how a lot about that person's life and all the things that come with that. So, in this sense of things being political, I think every labelling of autism is political.
But without a label, how would I know how to help them? What I did with my other children wasn't helping them.
Good. So, what do you mean by help?
Bringing him up, just being able to communicate.
Right.
So we had no communication at all.
Yeah.
So he was discovering the world on his own.
Mm.
And when you have no language with a 2-year-old, zero communication.
I'm not sure I fully understand, so tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but it's political in the sense that, given that diagnosis, what that does is, so for him, and I assume this was a good thing for him, it was helpful, is that right?
Well, he's happy now.
Okay, good. So, it seems to be a political act in the sense that a medical diagnosis of like a virus or something like that, what that should do is give you access to something like medication or some sort of medical therapy or something which is going to cure or treat or prevent. So that's what medicine is supposed to do. If someone is given a diagnosis, that's not generally what happens. So you might get access to different places, certain schools maybe, or not allowed in certain schools, or you might get some certain funding for certain forms of education. You might be helpful in ways that you can then read books or find information written about or by similar people. I don't see any of these as medical, like these aren't essentially medical practices, even though we speak of them in medicalised terms. There, it's about.
It can't be cured doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have a medical definition or terminology. There are lots of things that we can't cure, or don't even, and this happens to be one we wouldn't want to cure because it's essentially that person. But and I'm speaking personally, so it's a parental perspective. It gave me the ability to support and find that help and come here even.
I think one of the things I've learned from autistic self-advocates is, well, two things. The first is it may be that acquiring a label, acquiring collective sense of pointers to need is a very useful thing. It does, as you said, you needed a pointer, maybe that your son, who was autistic, needed access to different things from your neurotypical sons. So the idea of a label and an umbrella collective sense of these are these needs, if it's met by, for example, public services, that can be a useful thing. The question is whether it needs to be medicalised. Does it need medical professionals to make it a pathology? Does it need to sit within the psychiatric domain as if it were other forms of things that are seen as more traditionally medical? So I think that's one thing. And the other thing where I don't know if we would agree, if autism exists in an organic way, or if it is, as Frankie Happy has said and others, there are many autisms, or with different medical, biological realities, but they all meet these behavioural umbrella characteristics. It may be that then there are relevances to having an aspect of medical treatment, as I say, for the comorbidities. The question of taking a pill and feeling better, I think actually for some of the co-occurring conditions and comorbidities, taking a pill can make an autistic person feel better. It doesn't make their autism change, but it might make them feel better for their other co-occurring problems without affecting their autistic identity as an individual or as a political identity. Does that help?
Thank you, yeah.
So it might.
People always talking about height and weight. Can people hear me, or it would be useful to have a microphone in case anyone is using their hearing aids for accessibility. But I don't think it's either or. That a label serves multiple purposes. I would see an autism label as a disability as well as a lot of other things rather than a medical label, and that a disability label is partly political because it then enables autistic people to join the disability movement. And this doesn't stop it also being neurodiversity and an aspect of difference. In terms of treatment for co-occurring conditions, sometimes, yes, tablets work on a short-term basis, but I think a lot of that is actually changing the environment and getting rid of the issues such as oversensory stimulation, poverty, discrimination, which cause both mental and physical ill health. Okay, this is complicated to try and put in a few minutes. In terms of a diagnosis, I would suggest that it should possibly be a mechanism for facilitating services, that people should be able to access services without. But in practice, the services often aren't available. But I think, and obviously people also have their individual identities, and many of us also have multiple identities. And for those of us with multiple identities who are diagnosed late, it's maybe a sort of one of many coming out as part of a process of accepting us, ourselves. But I think a lot of the problem is that it's still a stigmatized identity, and that needs to be changed, and that it should become a neutral identity, which would totally change the dynamics of it.
And what do the panel think about how one can reduce the stigma of the identity relating to that point? Anyone wants to?
Sorry, I don't mean to dominate. Panel, I'll go on. I think the self-advocacy movement and its allies are doing well in research terms and multimedia terms in reminding people of autistic strengths. So that, for example, a mother said, I love my child to death, but I hate his autism. And she went on to say, he's funny, he's inventive, he's creative. That's his identity, not his autism. And one response is, well, actually his sense of humour and his creativity and maybe his non-conformity, that can all be part of his autistic identity as well. But it has been so pathologised because it's been deficit all along. And I think the more we know people who are autistic, be they those with profound learning difficulties, through to the Greta Thunbergs, who are indeed hoping to save the world. I think she's a wonderful example of autistic strength. I think we just have to keep talking about the whole, the many human manifestations that autistic people, whatever their disabilities, possess. and that the comorbidities, I don't think learning disability is a problem in the way that epilepsy or gastrointestinal problems are a problem, but we need to keep emphasising the strengths and keep hoping to influence the American Psychiatric Association to include them in the next criteria.
A lot of questions, but
Just quickly to just have my say, just to respond. I think just to emphasise that the naming of anything, the classifying of anything, particularly the diagnosing of anything, is a political act, is a social, sociological act. People who are interested in medical sociology might sort of know the subfield of the sociology of diagnosis. Anne-Marie Juppel's work might really help to sort of understand some of the ideas that we're getting at here. And I think that would be my answer to the question of how we can, or what we can do about the stigma that we experience, some of the marginalisation and the other experiences of social discrimination that we have, in that we can learn from other groups, other individuals, other communities who have had similar experiences. It can be problematic when we say that, because the answer that often comes back is, well, being autistic isn't the same as being gay, being autistic isn't the same as being black, and that's not what the argument suggests. Of course, we know that being autistic is pretty much like being autistic, but the world is common to all of us. We all inhabit the same world, and social experiences are things that we have in common. And actually, social oppression is really boringly repetitive. If you begin to sort of unpick some of the histories and the social movement theory and the way that social change happens, you begin to understand that actually it's a bit like a game of chess, and you can see, well, this is that move and that's that move, and this is how they're silencing me now, and this is how we're resisting now, and this is progress, and this is cultural change and things. You can identify patterns, and in doing that we can learn strategies for ourselves. We can create our own kind of playbook, if you like, for sort of playing the whole chess of sort of social resistance. And I think that's what we need to do. I think we need to sort of learn our social history in order to take our kind of social place.
Just on that, because autism has been like so bound to our social understanding. So during World War II, when women were going off to war, it was to work. It was suddenly, it's the absence of a mother. That's what causes autism. When some dude wanted to benefit his pharmaceutical endeavors, it was vaccines. But everything's tied to a social movement, and that makes it inherently political. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist outside of politics. Regardless of what autism is to anyone else, I'd still be autistic in a vacuum, because it is an inherent part of kind of biological essence, as in, yes, there are social constructions of it. There are political, autistic people have been the fodder for policy and political infighting for like 100 years, down to what research we choose to fund and what research we decide isn't important. That shows how political it is. But that doesn't make it any less real. But my question, rather than that response, is, how do you fight kind of medicalization when it was born out of medicalization?
Anyone want to go at that one?
Well, as I said, I think we would need to move the diagnostic framework would need the the scheme would need to shift it. Even in the DSM-5, when I was, I worked with members of the neurodevelopmental disorders work group who revised the autism's diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 as part of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and I have a chapter in it in my upcoming book, and I don't profit at all from the book, so it's just a product of the project, and it'll be free to everyone. It'll come out in a few months, so I suppose watch this space. But I even that mentions that strengths can that focus interests can benefit education and employment, and de-emphasize interests and stemming and within the severity scale, because there was agreement that the focus of treatment, if that people shouldn't use the severity scale for treatment. It says it shouldn't be used for eligibility or provision of services, but we know it might be in the American Psychiatric Association opposed the attempt to get rid of it. But if it is used, it shouldn't be used. It should be used for maybe reducing cognitive rigidity, because that can sometimes reduce people's opportunities. But not for harmless stemming and or for people's focus interests. So, but I think we would need to recognize that differences and traits are contextually bound, and they can function as strengths or weaknesses in different contexts, and we probably would need to actually understand from the inside out, which is actually where even the medical system wants to go. But I think autistic people do tend to we're more likely to define autism from the inside, and I have a paper on autistic expertise, and autistic people were more likely to define it in cognitive and biological and in these different internal perceptual, these different internal ways rather than behaviorally. And if we can understand, I guess, the commonalities that unite people, I think that can, and how something that might look unusual, how it can actually help someone. For example, I think that we might better understand the complexity of differences and move beyond that. And I could make a point, if I have time, about how even the classification, even the label Connor's autism, for example, or I don't know if I should address an earlier point or not, or Asperger's own framework and the terms that he used and the way he used it, or the text that Connor wrote, how politically, I think, motivated it was and how socially, culturally bound it was. And I think they were intending to impact practice in a certain way and not have children necessarily. I think Connor didn't want children to be institutionalized, and he recognized the IQ test often didn't work for autistic people, and he had children with various language abilities and intellectual abilities, and yet people use the term in a way that has little to do with his actual 1943 paper, for example. So, and these diagnoses are separate from, they're not prescriptive, and yet people use them to try to help their child or themselves in specific ways. So it's always, whatever any people's individual differences are and any patterns that might occur and not be limited to autistic people, it's always political.
I've got a couple of comments, and I think we're going to have to finish up now because we're unfortunately running out of time. But I think with something like autism, it's going to be medicalised for quite a while yet. And so one thing I think we need to do is be critical, as we have been today, like this morning asking about what it is we're looking at for outcome measures, that kind of stuff. So keep people on their toes. And on a positive, we can promote other ways of seeing autism and bring the experience to life. So in culture, art, music, drama, and do a better job of that than has been the case at times in the past. And on that front, there's an event next week at the Uni of Kent, which is the second day is looking at gender and identities, but it's being led by the art department at the Uni of Kent. So that's something I'd like to see more of, is broader autism research and interdisciplinary work around these issues, and bringing that together. So I think that's a positive point to end on. So, thank you, everyone.